Welcome everybody to this event on human rights in the United States and particularly the human rights situation in Minnesota. My name is Phil Lynch. I work with the International Service for Human Rights and I'm delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the organisers, the Human Rights Centre at the University of Minnesota, Advocates for Human Rights, as well as the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. We meet obviously at a time of human rights regress and violations and abuses in the US, as well as globally perpetrated by the US. This event, among other things, I think will reflect on some of the parallels and linkages between the human rights situation in the US and human rights as affected through US foreign policy. In both instances, we see an increase in securitization, in militarization, in the unlawful and excessive use of force. We see a repression of free speech, of free assembly, and of dissent. We see a subversion of the rule of law and threats and sanctions against courts and tribunals, both domestically and internationally. We see rising racism, xenophobia, stigmatization, and attacks on minority groups. And we see a perversely proud contempt and disregard for the rule of law, both at the domestic level and at the international level. So that's the context in which we meet and in which the situation in Minnesota will be discussed. And I'm delighted, without further ado, to hand you to Amanda from the Centre for Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thanks to everybody here in the room with us and joining us online. I know we do have many colleagues and friends in Minnesota that got on their computers early to join us at 6 a.m. Minnesota time. So I'm Amanda Lyons. I'm from the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. We're one of the oldest or first human rights centers in the United States. And we've always had a focus in the history of the center on human rights in the United States, using international mechanisms to look at and advance human rights in the US, and of course, globally with partners around the world. But it is quite a unique experience to be here in Geneva this week, accompanying a delegation of my colleagues and friends, and here to speak about the situation in Minnesota. One of the many peculiar things that we're living in Minnesota, I would say, was one of the first statements or outputs that we saw from a human rights mechanism, which was by Morris Tidwell Binns, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Execution. And the first statement was focused on, in the same breath, the attacks and killings of Venezuelan ships and the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis kind of in the same, couple of paragraphs. So I think just as a premise before we turn to hear the experts today, our reflections are that some of the erosion of the rule of law, the expectations that we have of how our democracy functions, the impacts that we're feeling internally in the United States, we also see and share when we're talking to our law school colleagues in New Greenland and hearing the news in Iran and Ecuador. So we're here to kind of share our very hyper-local, as we've been saying in Minnesota, experience, but I'm sure that for many in the room, you'll see the threads of also what you're tracking here. So we're gonna run through the panel and make sure that we can leave 15 minutes at the end for questions that you might have. Before we kind of move to our panel of Minnesota experts, I'd like to invite UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawler, to join us up here for some first remarks. And we were very fortunate to have Mary and her team visiting us in Minneapolis in December for an academic visit. And so really appreciate this chance to have you open the conversation for us, especially as you're wrapping up such an impactful and meaningful time as the mandate holder. So we're really honored that you joined us, and I'll turn the microphone over to you. Yes, absolutely.
I forget halfway through. So I'm very happy to be here today, and thanks to Minnesota Friends for inviting me and to ISHR for helping facilitate this event. And as Amanda said, I had the good fortune to visit the Twin Cities last October, where I was hosted by the Human Rights Program at the University of Minnesota. In addition to meeting students and staff at the university, I had the opportunity to sit down with human rights defenders working on a variety of issues, from the rights of refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, to LGBTIQ activists, to community groups seeking accountability for law enforcement violence. I visited before the murders of Renee Good and Alec Pretty, and what I heard in Minnesota in relation to abuse of police power, violence, and denied justice shocked me. This also helped me understand that the justice of the horrific events of 2026 were not an aberration. They built on years of misconduct, cover-ups, and targeting of human rights defenders. I met with family of Black men who were shot dead by police during routine traffic stops, and heard about the intimidation and harassment that followed when families tried to get justice. I learned about the securitized response to mental health episodes, whereby police rather than mental health professionals are dispatched in such situations. This has led to a number of avoidable deaths and subsequent obstruction to the pursuit of justice. I spoke with LGBTIQ activists who told me about their fear and the fear in which they now live their lives, while academics and students advocating for Palestine spoke of threats, harassment, suspensions, censorship, and arrest. Yet despite the scale and nature of the right to defend rights in Minnesota over the years, the attack on it, what stayed with me most, I think, was the remarkable community spirit I witnessed. The grassroots initiatives that have sprung up to assist people, the resilience in the face of structural racism, the desire to do what's just rather than what's easy. One such example is the voluntary organization Community Against Police Brutality, which Michelle Gross set up 25 years ago. In the past quarter of a century, the organization has reached out to countless families who have lost relatives to police violence and have accompanied them on the path to seek accountability. Despite so many setbacks, including the firebombing of their offices in 2012, I was inspired to see how fiery Michelle remains, determined as ever to see justice for her community. Another woman I met, Toshira Garraway, described how she began to organize families after years of stonewalling, harassment, and intimidation following the beating to death of her partner by police in 2009. When she asked questions about the circumstances of the killings and demanded to see the video evidence, it was then that police cars began to be stationed outside her house and she started being followed. I stayed quiet out of fear for many years, she said. But then in 2019, she decided she had enough and founded the group Families Support Families Against Police Violence, mentored by Michelle Gross and others. These are just two examples of why I believe human rights defenders in Minnesota are well placed to respond to this latest assault on the rights of their community. They are well networked, well organized, and well motivated, clearly. One of the reasons why I'm so glad that this particular event is taking place is because I believe greater international outreach and monitoring, including by special procedures, is necessary in Minnesota and indeed elsewhere in the US. But we can only act if we get the information and the consent of the alleged victim. Thanks to our short trip last year, we now have good contacts and are keeping up to date with developments. But my term, as Amanda said, finishes next month, so I would encourage you to make yourself known to the new Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders shortly after they take office. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing the rest of you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, that was a very, I think, smart and accurate description of the kind of the setting in Minnesota. Of course, this is not happening in a vacuum, and we hope to speak not only to some of the violations and harms that people have seen, but also what we think are very creative and important responses. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues at the table. We have just a short interventions prepared, and then we'll move into Q&A. I'm just going to ask the panelists to kind of, since we have one microphone, to just pass it along, and I'll just be the timer. All right, so to get us started, I'd like to hand it off to Sarah Brenes, who is the Executive Director of the Binger Center for New Americans at our law school.
Thank you so much, Amanda. As Amanda said, I'm with the Binger Center for New Americans. We're part of the University of Minnesota Law School, a similar center, and work in partnership with organizations, nonprofits, and law firms that do work in the area of immigration law, and have a focus on expanding access to legal services to non-citizens, as well as train law students in representing non-citizens in working to defend and expand their rights in the United States. My goal with my short time is to sort of set up some of what we'll call the crumbling blocks that have led to the erosion of rule of law across the United States, specifically related to immigration policy. And I'll start with shortly after, within days of President Trump taking office in January of 2025, there was an important memo that rescinded a longstanding policy for immigration to not do enforcement in protected areas, in spaces that are considered civic and cultural gathering places. And I'm going to provide the list of these places and have you keep in mind that here we are a year later, that we could probably give you an example of nearly every one of these places where there was an enforcement action. So those protected spaces included schools, preschools, K-12 schools, higher education institutions, healthcare facilities, hospitals, doctors' offices, community health clinics, places of worship, places where children gather, playgrounds, bus stops, social service establishments, including domestic violence shelters, food pantries, disaster and emergency response sites, including evacuation routes, cultural and civic gathering spaces, including weddings, funerals, religious ceremonies, parades, demonstrations, rallies. And the memo also specified that officers, this previous memo, should not go near protected places. So that might include sidewalks, entrances, parking lots. And there was a separate memo that also spoke specifically to situations where enforcement operations can and should not be happening within courthouses. So that was a signal to the community that taking away those protected spaces would have a drastic impact on individual communities in regard to immigration enforcement. Later in 2025, there was a funding bill that gave $85 billion to the immigration enforcement operation, funding actions and creating detention facilities that continue to be built to hold migrants. As a comparison, 10 years earlier, that funding was $6 billion. And that $85 billion outside all of the US state and local law enforcement combined, and comparable to annual defense spending from several nations. And it also outsized the budget that was given to the Department of Justice, which also had lasting impacts in terms of some of the litigation and cases that were brought in the government capacity to litigate those cases. In September, there was also a really important Supreme Court case that essentially gave immigration officers permission to use racial profiling to carry out enforcement actions. What's been now called Kavanaugh stops allows enforcement officers to use criteria such as apparent race or ethnicity speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, and presence at particular locations or the type of work one does. So the immigration officers were allowed to use that criteria in order to carry out targeted enforcement. And then since about September to present, we have seen targeted ICE enforcement in cities and states that have taken a stance to hold up human rights of migrants in their communities. Oftentimes, this is through local ordinances and state laws that choose to dedicate their local law enforcement to protecting community rather than dedicating their local funds and limited resources to enforce federal immigration law. And then finally, another precursor was the way that warrantless arrests are authorized by the Immigration Service. Typically, the Constitution protects and prohibits unlawful search and seizure that applies to non-citizens. So ICE would need a warrant or probable cause to detain an individual. And that probable cause needs to establish that the person is illegal, undocumented, or overstayed their status here in the United States, and that they're likely to escape before the officer could obtain a warrant. Significantly, in the case of administrative warrants, that does not extend to home entry. Yet what we saw repeatedly was entry into homes without warrants, case after case. A few examples that we saw in Minnesota and in other locations as examples of the abuse of force were kicking down doors of people's homes, breaking windows of people's car and pulling them out of the car to detain them, pinning people, running cars off the road in order to detain them, and a consistent lack of transparency and accuracy in the factual situations. There's one example where ICE officers brought an individual into a hospital who had a skull fracture and claimed that the person had injured themselves while they were handcuffed. And that's just one of many examples. The other thing that I'll end on before passing to my colleague who has additional information about these and other issues is the issue of enforced disappearances that we've seen. The way that the Immigration Services enforcement operations are detaining people and having them be incommunicado from their family for days or weeks. They're not posting information about where people can be located, prohibiting physically and through technological means access to counsel, not having working phones, and also having intermittent enforced disappearances by transferring people multiple times to different detention facilities that continue to be constructed throughout the country. And when individuals have asserted their right to hold the government accountable and establish the legality of their detention, they've refused to comply with court orders for them to be released when a court has found that their detention was unlawful. And when individuals have been released, oftentimes they were released at the location far from home and they are not given their identity documents and need to find their way on their own without having those documents in hand. I'm going to hand it on to my colleague to continue and provide some specific examples and some litigation approaches that we've had as well.
Thank you, Sarah, for that uplifting conversation. And I'm sure we will all continue this journey together. My name is Michelle Garnett McKenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the Advocates for Human Rights, and I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for your visit. Thank you for calling attention to these human rights violations. And thank you for pointing out, I'm looking at Mary Lawler, I apologize. Thank you for pointing out that the building blocks for this current moment were in place prior to the ICE deciding to come to Minnesota for Operation Metro Surge. Two key areas that we have seen significant erosion has been undermining of our refugee protection system, which is being systematically dismantled before our eyes. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, the retaliation, intimidation, and extrajudicial killings of people in civil society who are protesting people who are in government who are opposed to the current administration. But I have to preface all of this by saying that, in fact, very little has changed in the law around immigration enforcement. The spotlight is on us now, and we can see the impact at scale of this kind of investment in detention infrastructure, in the refusal to follow court orders, things like that. We are seeing them at scale now, but they have been a feature of the U.S. immigration law for years and a feature of U.S. policing for decades as well. Regarding protection, two kinds of attacks have happened in recent months. One has been to take people who are in the process of seeking asylum, people who have an application for asylum pending, to terminate summarily those applications, place people into detention, and place them into the expedited removal process, where they have to kind of reapply to have access to applying for asylum, which they were in the process of doing, all from detention, being moved to multiple locations. Last week, we had someone released after 9 months in detention, finally still in the process of seeking asylum. They had walked into their first court appearance ready with an application for asylum, and that case was dismissed. They were taken into custody. The use of detention as a coercive means to get people to give up is overt, it's planned, it's tactical, and it's working. That has been combined with the use of third country removals, or the threat of third country removals. Now our clients go into their asylum hearings and they're told, well, I don't care where you're from, are you going to be afraid in Eswatini? Because we have an agreement with that country for your removal. And people face, again, months of detention, only to potentially be removed to a country they have no contact with and can't make a refugee claim against. So accept a removal order back to the home country. That erosion of access to asylum was met with an additional hurdle to refugee protection in Operation PARRIS, PARRIS, no slander to the city. There are 2 R's in Operation PARRIS, and that has sought to re-vet and re-adjudicate the refugee status of recently arrived refugees, meaning they have to re-prove their case, even if they were admitted as a refugee to the United States. They started that process in January by apprehending, detaining, and transferring out of Minnesota hundreds of refugees to detention centers in Texas and other cities or other states. And although litigation has stopped the detention, they are still determined to re-vet and thus take away granted refugee status illegally. This is a part of what we see globally, the rollback of the right to seek asylum, the rollback of the right to have refuge is concerning to all of us, and this is just the latest salvo. It is dramatic and breathtaking. Alongside this is the repression of those who are speaking up. Civil society has faced intimidation, much as we heard from the special rapporteur. This is truly breathtaking to have our colleagues followed on the street, to have ICE show up at protesters' houses ahead of them, saying we've mapped your location using facial recognition or license plate readers. We know where you live and we'll show you that. We've got reports of multiple government officials being surveilled and having ICE officials filming their property, standing outside their homes, intimidating their staff. All of this is a precursor, of course, to greater repression of civil liberties. We do know that immigrants and refugees in Minnesota are the target of this operation, but they are not the end game. That, this is about strengthening the government apparatus to intimidate and harass, and making it normal to arrest, detain, and disappear people who don't agree with that. Who is next?
Jan.
Jan? I'm going to turn things over to Jan Conlin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jan Conlin. I'm an attorney in Minneapolis, and I'm also a volunteer with the Advocates. And I'd like to talk to you briefly about the impact that ICE has had on the school systems and the education of kids. As Amanda mentioned, in January of last year, they rescinded safe spaces, guardrails for agents to not arrest people on playgrounds, in the front yard of school buildings, on buses, at bus stops, school bus stops. And it has been unbelievably traumatic for the communities in Minneapolis and the kids in particular. If you think about it, you've got men in tactical gear and long guns more suited to, war than standing on a street corner as kids are trying to get on the bus. After the murder of Renee Goodman, all of the Minneapolis public schools shut down for 2 days. When they came back, all of the kids of color, or large percentages of them, were not in class. Unlike COVID, that was a shared experience amongst the children in the United States. This has not been. The only kids showing up remotely were kids of color. And unlike COVID, where there was resources and funding to do virtual learning, it doesn't exist. So some of the school districts have been able to do virtual learning, some haven't. Some have just had to post homework assignments on portals and hope the kids find them. Families are afraid to leave their houses. Kids in Minneapolis and in the state of Minnesota get both breakfast and lunch for free. Those kids who were afraid to leave their houses had no food. So there was a volunteer network of teachers and parents who started delivering groceries to those families and are continuing to do so today. Because even though the ICE presence is down at its height, they had 3,000 ICE agents. In Minneapolis, by way of comparison, has 800 police. 3,000 ICE agents swarmed the local police department. And so even though they now are down to 1,000, people are still afraid to leave their houses. So it's an ongoing issue. It's terrorism. It's terrorism and by the way, kids of color were not showing up at school regardless of their immigration status. There were kids of color who were US citizens who were afraid to leave their houses. And in the United States in general, it's estimated that 1 out of 4 children live in a house with a migrant or an immigrant of some sort. And so entire families have just stayed home. And kids can't learn if they don't feel safe, and this community has been absolutely terrorized. So the kids have really felt the impact.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Calla and I'm a physician, so not a lawyer. I practice pediatrics and internal medicine, and I'm an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Minnesota. And I want to mention the egregious violations of the right to health that we've heard about already, but also to talk a little bit about the pervasive nature of the structural racism that has prevented many members of our community from fulfilling their right to health. Over the course of the last year, in conjunction with the policies that Sarah Brenes has talked about, we have seen declining access to care and the declining availability of services. Over this period of time, what we have seen is worsening health indicators. So early laboratory studies, things like blood pressure measurements, things like children's asthma control, worsen over time as these policies have happened. With the beginning of Metro Surge, we saw an incredible drop-off of families and children seeking care in our community. And in addition to the drop-off in seeking care, we saw children and families who waited until they were in extremis to present to the emergency room. And while presenting to the emergency room, had to contend with the possibility that they could get picked up by a military armed person and taken away in this really difficult moment. In addition to the decreased access for the right to health, just like my colleague Jan mentioned, we have seen rising rates of hunger, and the hunger is not distributed equally. What we have seen is that for people who have a minority identity, in addition to being a person of color, so for example, people who have an Indigenous background, are queer and trans individuals of color, the hunger is more pervasive because there are fewer networks for access and heightened levels of fear because the xenophobia has really affected folks. These effects, while there has been a drawdown of individuals and actions for Metro Surge, we know that these are going to be pervasive and long-term. We've seen rising rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, suicidality, behavioral change in adults, but also in children. We know that childhood is an incredibly vulnerable time for a person's development, and these effects are going to be long-standing and long-term and require a huge investment from the local, national, and global community to help families heal. And in addition, it is our families of color. Anti-discrimination has been completely violated in this right to health. Finally, I just want to touch briefly on the health effects of detention. We know that people are being injured during their period of arrest. There's not adequate treatment and care for those injuries. And then we are seeing people coming out of detention with severe mental health effects and severe consequences of their injury and untreated illness. I have a lot more to say about health, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to pass along to my colleague.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Jessica Klander, and I'm the president of the Hennepin County Bar Association. Thank you to the Human Rights Center for the invitation, and the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institution, and the ISHR for hosting us. It's a privilege to be here with you all in Geneva. The Hennepin County Bar Association represents the community of lawyers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are dedicated to fostering access to justice through 3 pillars: advocating for the legal profession, ensuring a fair and accessible legal system, and promoting public confidence in the rule of law. Bar associations play a unique role in the democratic society. We understand how court systems function, and we're uniquely positioned to assess the judicial institutions and how they are operating, whether they are operating independently and effectively. Because of our focus on the role of lawyers and the obligations of our oath, we are uniquely positioned to see and confront the erosion of the rule of law in our country. In response to Operation Metro Surge, the Hennepin County Bar Association has mobilized its member attorneys in line with our unique and important mission. We've convened attorneys across practice areas and political perspectives, and we've worked in collaboration with other Minnesota bar associations and engaged with bar leaders across the country. We have issued joint statements, and we've joined legal action to defend constitutional principles. As you've heard, Minneapolis has become, in many respects, a microcosm of broader domestic and international tensions involving constitutional governance in the United States. What we are experiencing locally in terms of the independence and functionality of the legal system reflects larger national trends and threatens democratic institution, the separation of powers, and the rule of law. We've seen retaliation against law firms that have represented parties challenging policies of the current United States administration. We've seen government pressure directed at firms to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and to curtail pro bono initiatives. Some clients have terminated their representation with law firms out of fear of the continued engagement that could jeopardize their federal funding or governmental relationships. These pressures have produced a chilling effect across the legal community and influence the underlying context in which the harms my colleagues have described are taking place. We're seeing attorneys express reluctance to be publicly identified in matters involving criticism of the federal government, and law firms and businesses that have historically spoken out during most moments of constitutional crisis have remained silent for fear of retribution. That silence is shocking for the legal community in Minnesota and the country. And it's one important indicator of institutional strain. The impact of the federal operations on our courts has been tangible. In a recent order, Chief Judge Patrick Schultz of the Federal District of Minnesota found that federal authorities had violated more than 210 court orders and warned that continued noncompliance could result in criminal contempt. Such findings are extraordinary. They reflect not merely disagreement, but a breakdown in adherence to judicial authority. We've seen individuals detained at courthouses, the presence of armed enforcement activity in courthouse settings, and a surge in habeas petitions and emergency filings tied to detention practices. These developments strain court resources and disrupt the regular functioning of judicial systems. Courthouses must remain neutral forums for the resolution of disputes. When they become places of fear, access to justice suffers. At the heart of the HCBA's mission is promoting public confidence in the rule of law. Recent events have significantly and broadly subverted public confidence in the rule of law. Americans have the right to speak, to protest, and to observe government activity in public spaces. When enforcement practices appear designed to create uncertainty, where agents are masked and force is used quickly, the result is self-censorship. Oversight diminishes and trust erodes. Taken together, these developments signal more than isolated activities. They represent stress fractures for the rule of law itself. Minnesota's experience underscores a broader truth that we are seeing that is also at the heart of the human rights institutions and processes here. Safeguarding judicial independence and protecting the integrity of the legal profession are not local or regional concerns. They are foundational to democratic governance everywhere. Bar associations serve a distinct role in democracy, grounded in our understanding of the courts and our oath to uphold the rule of law. We are not only uniquely positioned to identify and respond to threats, but we are duty-bound to act. The Hennepin County Bar Association remains committed to equipping its lawyers and working with other bar associations in the US and abroad to defend these principles and to support a legal system that is fair, independent, and worthy of public trust. I look forward to taking any questions that you have and continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. To round out the prepared remarks that we have before we move into questions, I'd like to invite Lucy McKenzie from Human Rights Watch to join us. And I'll take just a second before I hand over the microphone, Lucy, to say on a personal note, we welcomed a research team from Human Rights Watch to Minneapolis maybe a month ago now. And I just wanted to share that this was my experience, and it was also the experience of other colleagues that we've heard from. We kind of facilitated a lot of interviews with a lot of different people, professional contacts, but also close personal friends from different spaces. And the resounding response was that the interview with Human Rights Watch was a very positive, validating experience in a really difficult moment. And I think that is a huge testament to your team. So a special thank you to Human Rights Watch and to Lucy for making the time to join us today for the panel.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for your kind words. I'll pass it on to my colleagues who went to Minnesota, and thank you also for your hosting us there and welcoming us so that we could carry out our work in Minnesota. And thank you to all the colleagues who come to Geneva, because I think it's really great to hear from people from the ground about what's really happening in the country and have that kind of detailed analysis from a lot of different perspectives. So thank you very much for that. So colleagues, I hope you've already heard Human Rights Watch bringing up our concerns about the human rights situation in the United States at the Human Rights Council, because we've been doing so pretty consistently now for the past year. You know, we really see it as a very dangerous slide into authoritarianism. And having, worked on a lot of countries that are authoritarian, we see a lot of similarities now coming up, and I think that's extremely concerning for everyone. We have increased our monitoring, reporting and advocacy on the United States. We've always worked on the United States, but we're doing much more now in response to this. I think there's a couple of through lines that I wanted to just highlight in terms of all of our work, not only in Minnesota, but at the United States. And most of these things are things that the colleagues from the panel have already mentioned. So just, I don't want to repeat too much, but the first point being that, we see the real damage of the Trump administration is doing at the moment isn't just any single action or decision, but a deeper shift from power grounded in rules and alliances to power enforced through coercion, whether that be military or economic as well. Secondly, the human rights concerns that we're seeing at the domestic level are being very much mirrored by actions at the international level and in foreign policy. Excuse me, and that's been mentioned by a couple of people. And thirdly, that racism is really a primary feature of the policy of the Trump administration, unfortunately. So we see US foreign policy now dividing the world into civilized peoples and dangerous peoples. We see migration seen as invasion, as criminal, as contaminants. We saw the suspension of the refugee admissions except for white South Africans. We see military force or use and threats of force mostly targeted against black and brown peoples, cities and nations. We see the rule of law and independence of the judiciary at very severe risk, and I think this is really well explained by our last speaker here. I think that's clearly reflected at the international level, where the administration is attacking international rules, international institutions, international accountability, sanctioning and threatening courts, prosecutors, a special rapporteur, of course, and civil society actors who are engaging in justice initiatives. And at the domestic level, as we've already heard, the administration ignoring laws, ignoring court orders, attacking judges who don't rule in their favour, retaliating against law firms, dismantling oversight mechanisms, and so on. So I think the important point there being we've seen very severe undermining of a key check on executive power. And finally, the use of force and lawlessness in defence. So again, both at the international level, where the US is really prioritising the use of force or the threat of force and arms sales over diplomacy, over human rights and global rules, where military power now is the primary instrument for managing problems rather than a last resort. And we've heard about the misuse today of the military domestically as well. So the National Guard being deployed in Los Angeles, Chicago, Memphis. We've reported on all of these, and there's more information on our website about that. And the excessive use of force and arrests without judicial warrants by federal law enforcement and immigration officers. So I just wanted to also zoom in a little bit about our work when we visited Minnesota and our reporting on the situation there. It's in the context of the abusive immigration policies and enforcement, which I think has been very well described by the panel, so I don't want to go into that in too much detail. But we have excuse me, documented the administration limiting access to asylum, seeking to terminate temporary protected status for thousands of people, summarily removing people to third countries, despite very clear risks in those third countries. Also, the administration carrying out violent and abusive immigration detentions, raids, deportations throughout the country. And again, there's more information about this on our website, including, and we've heard about this already, in homes, in workplaces, at courthouses, medical centres and university campuses. These raids and detentions have regularly entailed racial profiling and the targeting of black and brown people. Last year, the immigration enforcement actions in Los Angeles and Chicago were met with large protests, and the law enforcement crackdowns on these protests clearly violated free speech and assembly rights, and we reported on those as well. In both places, we documented excessive use of force by federal agents against peaceful protesters, legal observers and journalists, including the use of chemical irritants and the firing of projectiles resulting in very serious injuries. And of course, in Minnesota, the campaign there has also sparked pushback from residents, and we've seen people take to the streets in protest and organise to systematically document the abuses by federal immigration agents in real time. And we've seen a widespread effort to support those residents who cannot leave their homes due to fear and risks to their physical safety. Some of the colleagues on the panel have described the really pretty incredible networks that have been established to assist people in neighbourhoods, organising to drive people to appointments, deliver groceries and other necessities, and accompany children to school. And this local resistance has also been met by severe state violence. Obviously, you will have seen the killing of unlawfully of Renee Good and Alex Pretty, who were out on the streets supporting and protecting their neighbours. But also the really chilling message that this sends to immigrants, to observers, to protesters and bystanders. So when we went to Minnesota, we did interview people who had experienced or witnessed abusive actions by federal agents while they were monitoring or protesting. And we also interviewed US citizens who were detained by federal immigration agents while observing them. Again, more information about this is reported on our website. I think one of the overwhelming kind of remarks that came back from immigrants who went to Minnesota was this widespread sense of fear. People described to us that they were reluctant to speak out and reluctant to even continue their observing of agents, immigration agents. But we also heard many people also describing their deep pride in the community's response to what was happening. And so just wanted to underline there how much this community support has really been essential in the state. We talked to families who were trapped in their homes, who were afraid to go out for necessities like medical care or work. Many businesses spoke to us saying that they'd lost profits or had to reduce their opening hours because of fear of ICE's abusive conduct, which is leading customers and employees to stay home. And we've already heard about, of course, many children missing school and what the impact that has on their right to education. So the federal government has reduced the number of agents in the state, but we've really yet to see any commitment to human rights respecting immigration enforcement policy, either in Minnesota or elsewhere. We've also yet to see any meaningful accountability efforts. Accountability obviously is complicated by the widespread practice of federal immigration agents concealing their identities with face coverings and wearing plain clothes and operating out of unmarked vehicles. So, which makes it very difficult then to bring any sorts of accountability actions. We have been urging federal, state and local authorities to be taking immediate action to support the people who are most at risk in the short time and also to ensure accountability. We've also called for Congress to exercise its oversight function and appropriations authority to ensure that the federal agencies respect human rights, including by making the Department of Home Security and other federal funding contingent on human rights minimum safeguards to protect against excessive use of force and other rights violations. So just to finish up and to bring it back to delegations here in Geneva, our call to delegations is really for you to be speaking out in a principled way about the rights violations that we're seeing in the United States right now, both domestically and in terms of its foreign policy. We're also calling on you to speak out strongly in defence of the international human rights system and the rule of law, as colleagues have already said. Otherwise, we really see that states are giving into the law of the jungle. We think this is really a key test particularly for those states who would count themselves as at least former allies, perhaps, of the United States, and who have been accused of double standards in the past. We really think this is the moment where you need to be taking a principled approach and a consistent approach and speaking out about rights violations wherever they occur, whether that's in the United States or in other countries. Thanks very much.
You can join me in thanking the panelists. Great. So we do have a little bit of time. We'd love to take a question here from the room. I'll say our group is actually bigger than even who's here, and we'll be in Geneva and of course available after the event and virtually, but we'd love to take a question from someone in the room.
Sure, I'll start. I didn't see any other hands. Just to break the silence.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Carol Dehan. I work with the UNHCR. I'm a senior legal advisor there. My question is to you, the Bar Association. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name already. Yes. And I was really intrigued to hear that 210 court orders have been violated in your state alone. What is the Bar Association, what is the judiciary doing about that? Are they trying to hold the government in contempt? Are they slapping costs against them? Like, what is being done and how can we support you?
Wonderful. Should we take a couple questions maybe? Just we're just worried we don't have to collect questions. Yeah, is that okay? We can take just a couple more questions and then we'll go back to the panel.
I'm Ed O'Donovan. I work with Mary Lawler. Thanks. That was a fascinating panel. Question really for Jan and for all of you. But I'm very curious to learn more about the relationship between ICE and the police in Minnesota. If you could comment more on that. Thank you.
Is there one more?
You read the questions too for.
Sure, that would be helpful for Zoom. So we had a question about the court orders that are not being followed, and also a question of the relationship between ICE and police. So ICE as federal agents and police officers at the state or county level. So I'll come up to the panel for those. Jess?
Thank you for the question. So the judiciary in Minnesota has been really strong on the rule of law and enforcing it, and have called out the violations of the court orders, and has threatened and started to issue orders to hold in contempt. Beyond that, it becomes a question of what can be done. This is the very underpinning of our judicial system, and Judge Schultz in this latest order even called out the fact that that has never happened before. It's unprecedented. So some of this is figuring it out how we go. For the Bar Association, part of the work that I do and my colleagues do for the Hennepin County Bar Association is in hand with the state judges, but part of that is supporting and calling that out for the public, so that to make the public aware that there are court orders that are not being followed. There have also been legal actions taken against the administration that have pointed that out, as well as other constitutional violations. With many of us here have joined in those legal efforts against the administration for constitutional violations. But I think it's mobilization. Much of this is pretty grassroots when you have a government who is not following the rule of law or court orders of the judicial system. So a lot of this has had to be by necessity from a grassroots awareness and mobilization efforts.
Jason, please.
Go ahead.
I'm fine. You can do it. We can all do. Ison, please. The question was about that relationship between local police and federal immigration enforcement, and it's varied because we have a complex system of policing in the United States. In Minnesota, we have 87 counties. Each has an elected county sheriff who is a political person, their elected official, and so their policies vary widely depending on their base and their location. We have city police departments. We have a state patrol that is responsible for Minnesota's trunk highways. So there is a multiplicity of local units of policing with which to connect. We have spent years trying to disentangle and to fight entanglement of federal immigration enforcement with local police, and that has paid off in this moment. Particularly in Minnesota's major counties, where there's not only a couple of decades of legal prohibition against city officials of any kind, including police, in enforcing immigration laws. There's ordinances that prohibit that through organizing, but also a deep community dialogue. And much of this comes out of the history of police killings in Minnesota and the need for community relationships with them. Leading up to Operation Metro Surge, we had ongoing conversations with Minneapolis police about preparing them for the disorienting experience they were about to face when federal officials who do not, they are not trained as police in policing practices. They operate as a paramilitary force. They have a very different set of principles and oversight, preparing our local police to be ready to meet that. And we've had, I think, a much stronger response from not only our core city police departments, but also from suburban police departments. Sheriffs have been a different mind. So mapping your politics, I think, is a critical piece of that.
So the way I think you should look at it from an international perspective, ICE is the federal government's private police force. And I think that's the only way you can look at it. Doesn't have anything to do with the local officers who care and protect our communities. It is a paramilitary private police force that is being organized under the current administration and deployed across the country. And maybe it's immigration enforcement today. We don't know what it's going to look like tomorrow. But I think the only way you can look at it is basically a secret police. That's how I describe it. So, and then our law firm has been on the front line and suing ICE in Minneapolis. And one of the things that I would say is one of the limitations of our judiciary is that it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism beyond contempt of court or some of the things that they're threatening. And so if you've got an administration that is willing to just ignore what the courts are saying, it makes it difficult. I mean, we haven't given up. We continue to file the lawsuits, and the judges are just extremely aggravated about what's happened. And then they haul people from our Department of Justice into court, and then they end up quitting. And then you get someone new in the next week, and they don't like what's going on, so they quit, and you've got this constant cycle. So we're going to continue the fight, but I'm not sanguine on where it's going right now.
Can I see, I'll use my phone for Zoom. We're just coming up on time, and I know folks have really full agendas. I'm going to see if Calla and Sarah, if there's something you want to add as final remarks in the panel, and then I'll wrap us up.
I think just, echoing everyone's remarks here, I think a few of the things, some of the takeaways, I think there's been a longstanding culture in the United States to rely on our civil rights, and especially when I think of our youth and a sense of almost taking our democracy for granted. One of the really powerful things that I think we've witnessed is seeing the youth understanding just how fragile democracy is, and also getting out in the streets and in solidarity with the community. I think that's been really uplifting. And I think we've had conversations here about citizens in the United States recognizing that our civic rights are not enough, and looking outside of the United States to the international community to understand just how important talking about human rights in the United States is. And we hope to continue as we go back to bring all of the conversations we're having and all of the opportunities to work with y'all here in Geneva and in the United Nations to try to make those tools accessible to our communities and encourage them to continue to utilize them to advocate for human rights at home.
And I guess the final thing that I'll say is, I think all of us in Minnesota have just been in awe of the strength of our immigrant and migrant communities. And I think here we're talking about violations against them, and we're talking about sheltering in place and hiding. And also, these are families that are making a risk-benefit calculation and surviving, being separated and surviving. And in their survival, because people come from areas where human rights is more commonly talked about and more commonly known than in the United States. In their survival, they're teaching people who grew up in Minnesota about human rights mechanisms and just sort of where dignity lies. And that has been, I think, just an incredibly motivating piece of the last few months.
I'll make just two very quick final remarks. One is just to say that, I mean, we're here and available, but also we are the people that were able to, we have ECOSOC status, we pivoted to be able to come here on relatively short notice. There are so many organizations in Minnesota that are able to provide information and dialogue. And like Sarah was saying, we had a very last minute type briefing with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. We had more than 60 organizations in Minnesota on 48 hours notice respond and join a hearing. So there is an availability and willingness from our Minnesota organizations to share information. And just the second is very sincere thank you. I think in Minnesota we have reflected a lot on how crisis relies on these relationships across maybe organizations that haven't worked together before or working together. And so I really want to thank Francesca at the IBA HRI and also Phil and Diego here at ISHR and the team and Abby from the Human Rights Center. It means a lot. We just wouldn't be able to kind of have these really fruitful conversations. And so I appreciate all of you taking time out of the agenda. And I know it can be difficult to speak out against the state. I think Lucy gave us really clear kind of asks, but I think there's also ways to support the civil society engagement. And so I hope that all of you, to the extent that you're able, will kind of see where you might plug into these efforts. And I thank you all so much. And thank you to the panelists.